The history of world religions is rarely simple. Islam, however, might appear to be an exception. Here are the Prophet's biography, the Quran, and Chronicles. For decades, historians have debated whether Islam truly began in Mecca or possibly in other places, such as ancient Petra, and the version we're familiar with appeared later. These questions make us take a fresh look at what seemed to be unshakable. Friends, you're on the History Show channel. Today we're launching a new segment, Myths and Reality. In this segment, we'll be examining the most famous legends and controversial theories from Atlantis to the moon landing, from ancient tales to modern myths. Our goal is not just to present different versions, but to show where they came from and what the facts say. And we'll start with one of the most fascinating topics, the origins of Islam. The traditional version. So, according to Islamic tradition, everything begins in the 7th century in the city of Mecca in western Arabia. A merchant named Muhammad from the Quraysh tribe lived here. At 40, he received his first revelation from Allah and began preaching monotheism to pagans. But in Mecca, his idea was met with hostility. The city was an important religious and commercial center, and preaching against idols undermined the established order. As a result, Muhammad and his followers were forced to flee to Medina. This event is known as the Hijrah. From this point, Muslims begin their calendar. In Medina, the Prophet became both a spiritual and political leader. The first Muslim community, the Ummah, formed around him. Here, Islam became a force capable of rivaling the neighboring tribes. After several years of struggle, the Muslims returned to Mecca and established Islam as the main religion of the region. Muhammad died in 632, but by that time his teachings had already become a whole system of belief. His closest companions, the caliphs, continued to spread the religion. During their rule, the first compilation of the Quran appeared. Conquests were carried out, and the Islamic State expanded to unprecedented proportions. Within just a few decades, the Arabs controlled vast territories, from Spain to Persia. From the traditional point of view, it was during this period that Islam was finally established. All the main ideas and practices were established by the Prophet himself and his closest companions, and the following generations only consolidated and developed them. The emergence of the Revisionist school until the mid-20th century, this traditional account of the rise of Islam was accepted without question by most historians. But in the 1970s, a group of scholars emerged who suggested looking at everything differently. Among them were the American John Wansbrough and later Patricia Crone and Michael Cook. Their approach came to be called the Revisionist school. In other words, these were people who engaged in a radical re-examination of established historical concepts. The main idea of these historians is that early Islamic sources, such as the Quran, hadiths, and biographies of Muhammad, cannot be regarded as pure history. They were written down and finalized only 100 to 150 years after the Prophet's death, at a time when there was a struggle for power and new states were being formed. This means that these texts could reflect not only faith, but also the interests of the rulers of their time. Revisionists pointed out several problems. The first is, as already mentioned, the time gap. The first detailed biographies of Muhammad appear only in the 8th century. The second issue is contradictions. The same events are described in different versions, sometimes completely differently. And the third is political influence. The texts could have been rewritten or interpreted in a way that strengthened the positions of specific dynasties or caliphs. In other words, these scholars believe that to understand the origins of Islam, one should look not only at Muslim sources but also at external ones, Christian, Jewish, Greek chronicles, as well as archaeology. That's how the boldest hypotheses arose, such as Islam originating somewhere other than Mecca. We'll discuss them next. Theory: Islam was not born in Arabia. One of the boldest ideas of the revisionists was the hypothesis that Islam did not originate in Mecca or Medina at all. In the 1970s, it was proposed by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook in the book Hagarism. According to their version, at the beginning of the 7th century, Arab tribes were uniting with the Jews of Palestine in a joint religious military alliance. In sources from that time, for example, in the Christian treatise Doctrina Jacobi, a prophet among the Saracens is mentioned who leads the movement. Researchers believe that it could have been referring to Muhammad. According to this theory, the original movement of the Arab Jews was more of a messianic project, where Islam did not yet exist as a separate religion. Later, the Arabs ended the alliance, fearing absorption into Judaism, and started forming their own faith. At the same time, they borrowed much from Judaism and Christianity. Thus, Muhammad was presented as a new Moses, and Jesus was recognized as the Messiah, though not as a deity. This version concludes that Islam was formed not in the deserts of Arabia, but in the lands of the Levant, and only under the Umayyads, several decades later, did it take on the form we are familiar with today. However, this hypothesis has many weak points. It hardly takes into account Arab sources and relies heavily on external texts, which are often hostile to Islamic tradition. Even Wansbrough himself, the father of revisionism, criticized Crone and Cook for their one-sided approach. Archaeological findings in Arabia show early traces of the Muslim community right there. The Petra theory instead of Mecca? Canadian researcher Dan Gibson proposed the next prominent theory. According to it, the sacred center of early Islam was not Mecca at all, but Petra, the ancient city in Jordan. Gibson argues that the first 7th century mosques were oriented not toward Mecca, but north, toward Petra or Jerusalem. In the Hadiths, Mecca is described as a place with water, fruits, and livestock. However, modern Mecca stands in a dry valley. This description seems strange. Gibson and other supporters of this theory believe that Petra and its surroundings fit this description much better. In ancient times, complex irrigation systems were built in Botea. There were oases and orchards around the city. Unlike the almost lifeless valley of Mecca, in the 7th century, Petra was a well-known and wealthy city, located on trade routes, while there is almost no archaeological evidence of Mecca's significance during that period. It sounds convincing at first, but there's a serious catch. Firstly, architects in the 7th century did not have maps or precise instruments, so when building mosques, they oriented them to the south or northwest. Overall, a difference of a few degrees between Mecca and Petra could have been within the normal margin of error for them. We only notice this difference because of modern technology. Secondly, when sources talk about the fertility of Mecca, they might have meant a nearby region. For example, the city of Taif, which is known for its gardens and vineyards. Thirdly, at that time, Christianity already dominated Petra, while Islam originally emerged as a challenge specifically to paganism and idolatry. And fourthly, there are early Arab inscriptions from the 7th century found near Mecca, where the name of Allah and even Caliph Umar are mentioned. These are direct pieces of evidence for the existence of a Muslim community in the Hijaz. In other words, the Petra instead of Mecca theory is intriguing, but there is already a significant amount of evidence against it. When and who compiled the Quran? According to the traditional version, the Quran, the holy book of Islam, was finally compiled during the time of the third caliph, Uthman, around the middle of the 7th century. It's believed a single text was created then, and all other versions were ordered destroyed. Thanks to this, Muslims all over the world read the same Quran. But revisionists have a different opinion. They doubt that in the middle of the 7th century, the young community had enough resources and organization to collect and approve the final version of the text in such a short time. Some scholars believe that the text of the Quran remained flexible for several more decades. The final version may have emerged under the Umayyads or later during the Abbasids, around 100-200 years after the Prophet. Now let's review the supporters' arguments. The first argument: it's hard to believe that under Uthman, scattered records became a single collection in just a few years. The second argument is that the first biographies of Muhammad and commentaries on the Quran only appeared in the 8th-9th centuries. And the third is that the text could have been edited to serve the needs of the authorities, to emphasize their legitimacy. However, there are also strong arguments opposing late codification. One of them is archaeological findings. For example, the Quran manuscript from Birmingham, which is dated by radiocarbon analysis to the 7th century, that is, practically the time of Muhammad. Other ancient manuscripts include the Sana'a manuscript in Yemen, the Samarkand Quran, the Topkapi manuscript, as well as dozens of fragments from Syria, Uzbekistan, and Europe. All of them go back to the same Uthmanic archetype, and their unity is confirmed by modern research. The order of the surahs, the set of ayahs, and even the orthographic features match. There are no signs of multiple alternative Qurans, only minor orthographic differences. Some Quran passages are inconvenient for authorities. For example, the story about how the Prophet turned away from a blind man, or the accusation against his wife Aisha. If the text had been edited later, such episodes might have been removed, but they stayed. Thus, debates about the codification of the Quran continue. The traditional view relies on ancient manuscripts and the internal integrity of the text, while revisionists point to the political context and later written evidence. The origins of Islam are a topic where tradition and science clash particularly sharply. On one hand, there is the established narrative, the revelation in Mecca, the hijrah to Medina, the codification of the Quran under Uthman, and the rapid spread of the new faith. On the other hand, revisionists point to gaps in time, contradictions, and political influence, offering alternative versions, from Arab-Jewish alliances in the Levant to the Petra versus Mecca theory and late Petra concept. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Each version has both convincing arguments and weak points. Archaeology and manuscripts support the idea of early unity, but questions about the details still remain. That's exactly why such debates are important. They help us better understand how religions are born and how myths form around their origins. Friends, this was the debut episode of Myths and Reality on the History Show channel. In this section, we will figure out together what is true and what is legend, from ancient civilizations to modern conspiracy theories. Write in the comments which version of the origin of Islam seems more convincing to you, the traditional or the alternative one. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. We still have a lot of interesting things ahead. Goodbye, everyone.